Glenn, it's lovely to have this opportunity to sit down and chat together. We're going to focus our time together on some of the worries and concerns that might be on the minds of the next generation or the rising generation family enterprise.
Sure.
I recently read your book, True Wealth, Letters on Life, Love and Money, and it's sort of a series of letters where people, individuals within families, enterprises are expressing some of the worries and concerns that they have. And I think what really struck me in your book was a lot of focus is put on the worries of the senior generation, letting go, finding purpose in the next stage of life, how can they be fair or equal with their children that they love equally, how do they treat them fairly. But we don't often hear about what's on the minds and worries and concerns of their children, the next generation. And so your book really explores this. So what have you found in your work that informed your book that next generation members are worried about? What kinds of conversations are they wanting to have that they're maybe not having?
So let's start with the fact that there are conversations that they would like to have, but they find some of them very difficult to introduce in the family dynamic because they don't want to appear entitled or intrusive. But there are conversations that would, be very useful to them. For example, what is the family's estate plan and how should they therefore plan around it? I know many families have quite a lot of reserve about discussing that because they're concerned that if their next generations know what the resources are, that it might undermine their motivation in some sense. And of course that's a valid concern. But at the same time, if you've got capable, competent, self-sustaining next generation family members, it makes a lot of sense to think about bringing them in and sharing information with them. So that is an obvious concern that they might have. And the more that we do share information, the more there's a sense of inclusion and belonging in the family, which is what we want to engender.
Right.
So that would be one. I think another, which is a sort of conundrum for children from substantial wealth, is literally how are they meant to live? Where are they meant to pitch their lifestyle? So let's assume that through their growing up years and through their college years, everything was paid for them, and they probably lived at quite a nice standard of living. And then they get their first job and they want to be responsible, and the goal is that they would be financially self-sustaining, but realistically they're not going to be able to sustain themselves at the level that they were accustomed to in their family of origin. And they also know that at some point in the future they're going to be substantially wealthy. So what makes sense in that middle ground time? How are they meant to live? Are they meant to be potentially significantly philanthropic and generous because that's part of the family ethos, even though they don't have their own resources to be philanthropic with? What sort of homes should they be living in, and how should they pitch their lifestyle? Right. So there is no one right answer, but it is a question that they often would like help with.
So they're part of a family of wealth, but they themselves don't have wealth to spend.
Exactly.
And I guess my question to you is then, so they have this burden, this worry that they're carrying around with them. What level of life can I expect to live? How do they have that conversation with their parents to ask those questions? Because talking about money, as we know, is very difficult. So what advice would you have in terms of having that conversation?
So again, it's one of the conversations that can be difficult to raise because it's asking the parents to reveal information that they presumably have not yet chosen to share. So I just want to say that points us back to the need for much improved communication skills around money, not just about the nuts and bolts of money and how the stock market's going, but how money is affecting us and how it's affecting the dynamics in the family. And I think that those lines of communication should be both formal through, say, structured family meetings and also in informal ways. So it puts some onus back on the parents to build their comfort level around communication. But if you were a child and you were in that situation and you were trying to figure out, I would recommend to them that they find some activity, some experience that they're having that raises this question for them and hook their question to their parents on that. so that they can go to them and say, Mum and Dad.
So can you give an example?
Yes, there's one young woman I know who actually took a loan from her parents in order that she could buy really a substantial home. And the home made sense because she had 3 children and she needed an amount of space that they could live in a comfortable and appropriate way. But then the question becomes, at what level do you pitch the house? So I think the fact that she was talking with her parents about what property was right for her, that is a segue into the larger conversation about, well, where do your peers live and what are the homes like in their neighborhoods? And are those the neighborhoods you want to be living in? And if not, why not? And let's have this conversation. Right. So that could then open it up.
Right. And I think another thing I heard you say which resonated with me was not to have the conversation directly about how much money can I get or how much money am I allowed to expect, but rather to have a sort of learning conversation around learning some money skills, learning how to talk about money, and that might segue into being able to talk about direct problems. Is that what I understood you to be saying?
Yes, you can use something that's going on, a dynamic that's playing out between you. I mean, it could be even as simple as who pays for what when we go out for dinner together.
Right.
I'm a girl, but I'm from wealth and I'm out with my friends and they don't have the same resources as I do. Do I expect the men to buy me dinner? And if so, what restaurants can we afford to go to? And actually, I'd like to eat at a slightly better restaurant. Mom and Dad, how would you handle this?
Right. So it's not just about the money, it's about handling relationships and friendships.
Right, exactly.
Great. And in your experience, Diana, you mentioned that some parents are very reluctant to talk about their planning for the future because they don't want their children to know how much they're receiving because it might derail them. And so the children don't know. In your experience, what is the risk of not talking to your children about what they're going to inherit?
So I think that there are multiple risks, one of which would be that when this information is finally revealed, there may be a sense on the part of the children of, why wasn't this shared with me sooner? Why didn't my parents trust me? And that can therefore lead to some questioning of their parents' relationship to them and can have some knock-on effects. There's also the reality that if a parent is not ready and able to share at least a framework for thinking about the wealth, then they probably are also unwilling to really manage a process where their children are fully prepared for it. And that means having multiple conversations about different aspects of the wealth, introducing them to advisors, preparing them to, for example, have premarital agreements, all of the groundwork that needs to be done in order that they become skilled, capable, and confident in managing the resources that will one day be theirs. And if there's reticence about talking about it early on, then that whole process can get derailed.
Right.
Yeah.
I think another concern that rising generation members have is that they're aware that they're going to receive wealth, they're part of a family of wealth, but they're not aware of what the expectations are that are attached to that wealth. And some of those expectations are implicit, and how do we make the implicit explicit? Have you had that experience with next generation members?
I think it's a really important question because without being explicit, different family members can make assumptions. And the parents, because their expectations are so clear to them, may not even realize that they need to spell them out. And the next generation may not realize that they need to ask questions to clarify what the expectations are. They may clearly know some of them. And an obvious one is frequently voiced in families that you will get a premarital agreement if you marry. That's an expectation so that it protects the wealth. But there can be many other hidden expectations about how the next generation is meant to relate given this gift of the wealth. So I think the more that a family can get to the bottom of that and be really clear, the better for all of the parties.
So that framework that you've talked about for dialogue around all these issues becomes really important.
Sure.
Now, where can Rising Generation members get help? So your book is a wonderful conduit for that. I've actually used it myself in terms of framing conversations. But for young people that are watching, that are part of a family of wealth, that are struggling, where would you recommend that they look for help?
So I think there's a couple of next-gen movements, per se, that they might consider potentially joining. One of them would be Nexus, the Global Youth Summit, for example, where there are quite a lot of young wealth holders who collaborate with social entrepreneurs. So that's a collaborative place where they could learn from one another. And I would imagine that at the local level there would be other
peer groups.
So that they can share with each other.
Any books or courses that you would recommend beyond your own book?
For next gens, I don't specifically. I mean, if there were around particular topics, I could identify those, because one of the things that I do is come up with a whole educational strategy for next gens. So I could identify specific resources within categories.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So you have you help them develop a strategy for learning those skills.
Right.
What does that look like?
It looks like a tapestry, because in my experience, when you work with the next gen, you have to meet them where they are, and you have to capture their attention around topics that are of interest to them. You can't just say, I'm going to teach you financial skills 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You have to anticipate what it is that will draw them in and keep them engaged. So that means that you may dot all over the map and start with financial skill 5 and end up back at financial skill 2 and then zip over to financial skill 3. So it means that you have to customize the program and really know who that next gen is, so that you can communicate with them in language that they understand and using tools that they are familiar with. So bringing in technology, things like that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Diana. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Loved it. Thanks.